Hi, everybody. Welcome to week 6 of Supernatural Folklore. Couple of updates for you. I have finished making comments on all of your research paper topics, or at least all of the research paper topics that I received. Um, Most of them look pretty good, some of them look fantastic. For the folks that were missing something from their research paper topic, it was usually something about significance. So, what I'm looking for you to do is to tell me why it is important that we look at such of a thing, right? For several of you, I also needed you to narrow those topics down. Remember, guys, this is a 5 to 7 page paper, and although I know that sounds like a lot, it really isn't. Um, some of the topics that you guys have chosen, you can write books on it. And I don't think that you want to write a book this semester. Remember a comment that I made that I also made fairly frequently was I prefer for students to do deep analysis rather than a broad survey. What that means is in a 5 to 7 page paper, you can't tell me everything about vampires. You need to pick a particular example or a particular time period or something specific and focus on that deeply rather than try to do a whole bunch of topics. All right. I really do prefer that students do deeper analysis. So the more narrow your topic, the deeper that analysis can be. I know that sounds counterintuitive, but for you to really write deeply about something, it needs to be a much narrower topic. So, if you have questions about that, I am available to answer them, and I am happy to answer them. All of the topics sounded really interesting, so I'm excited about research papers. I usually am. So, I'm happy to help you. Um, so, if you need me, please let me know, and I will be happy to help you with that. Um, The first article that I ask you guys to read for this week is called Ghosts in Mirrors. It's by Elizabeth Tucker. And so Tucker here is writing about mirror games in this article. Um, Mirror games are pretty familiar to many of us. A lot of us have heard stories about Mary Worth or Bloody Mary. In film, you have the Candyman or the Bye Bye Man. Um, Lots of depictions in film, television, and literature about this particular form of play. Tucker reports that it was thought to be most popular with pre adolescent girls, think 11 and 12, 13. But in her research, she finds that there's an awful lot of college age students summoning mirror ghosts, and that not all of them were girls. So she calls on Linda Day's research into mirror ghosts themselves. Day is a folklorist who has done a lot of work with legends. And according to her, the mirror ghost has evolved in legend from being the ghost of an innocent victim to an aggressive spirit who bursts out of the mirror to attack. Right? So think about something like Resurrection Mary, um, who was originally thought to have been burned at the stake for witchcraft, and she wasn't actually a witch, and so now she comes back to haunt people, and she pops out of mirrors and gets you. Even if you've seen Candyman, even Candyman might fit into this category. You have someone who was lynched, a black man who was lynched for falling in love with a white woman, and so he was an innocent victim in that case. And now he is this vengeful spirit that comes back and gets people with his hook hand. So, um, Dag said that this is a kind of a pattern with the mirror ghost. Um, Dag says the primary reason that children do this, pre-adolescent girls do this, is about believing and trusting. They trust that there's some reward for believing, and then they escape the experience unharmed, which reinforces their belief, right? If you really believe in it, you won't get hurt. And if you don't believe in it, you will get attacked. And so the believing becomes part of the legend. Um, Tucker starts to diverge after this, though, because she says that her informants aren't pre-adolescent girls. So it's not really about believing and trusting. She says that believing and trusting are important. The process of daring and testing seems to be more important in analyzing the summoning of mirror ghosts at a later age and from male students. She claims this is a supernatural boundary that, like many boundaries have been set for young adults, can be stretched and examined. The group in this class is a relatively youthful crowd, from what I can gather. So you can think about the ways that you guys have stretched and examined boundaries since you began college, right? You don't have a curfew. You don't have rules about when you can fraternize with prospective romantic partners. No rules about um, eating dinner before dessert or eating dinner at all or what you eat for dinner or whether or not you uh, order an adult beverage with your dinner. All right. So while that can be completely liberating, and I haven't completely forgotten what it was like to be a student, it can also be something that's really scary. So many of the boundaries that you guys had were put in place with the goal of keeping you safe. And without those boundaries, you have to figure out how to keep yourself safe. And that can be a really big deal. Okay. It can be kind of scary. So it seems that kind of natural with all this change in how students identify themselves, and there are lots of ways that students' identities are changing. You're adults. You may have made discoveries about your gender identity, or your sexual orientation, or your view of romantic relationships, or your hair, or your way of dressing, or whether you wear or don't wear makeup. So it isn't hard to imagine the reflection of an unknown entity in the mirror as a way of exploring yourself. And that's one of the points that Tucker is making here. She's using Jungian archetypes or Jungian analysis here, which is something that you could consider doing in your research paper if archetypes are your thing. And she explains what that is. So, Carl Jung was a psychiatrist and a psychoanalyst that used the concept of archetypes to discuss the ways people perceive the unconscious. So these archetypes have extended into many fields. For example, the hero archetype of a person who meets a challenge that may initially overwhelm them, but then they eventually overcome that through their own self-discovery. This is often called the hero's journey. Joseph Campbell wrote about this, and you will find that in, you know, all kinds of literature and media, right? You can look at Jesus as an archetypical figure. You can look at Luke Skywalker as an archetypical figure, Harry Potter, Frodo. So you can look at any of these literary or film characters and kind of see these archetypes at work. Darth Vader may be the devil figure that possesses knowledge and power that the hero can use to eventually defeat him and overcome. You could look at Yoda as a kind of crone figure, old, wise, with esoteric knowledge that the hero needs. Although often the crone is a woman, right? And a witch type woman. Um, Jung contended that these archetypes are part of our collective unconscious, and we learn about them through our culture in lots of invisible ways, right? So, Tucker uses these archetypes to examine some memorates. And remember, I told you that memorates are personal experience stories. When memorates are spread, they become legend. But the memorate is the personal experience story. Those are what you shared with me predominantly last week when you told me about your ghost stories. Those are memorates. So she collected these memorates from the dorms at her college that she taught at. So for some of them, females reported seeing a male reflection in the mirror, and males report seeing a female reflection. And she interprets this according to a theory about the animus and the anima. But she also reports the way that context is a factor here. Many of the stories feature entities who supposedly committed suicide or died on campus in some other fashion. And in an environment of social change and academic pressure, the mental health and well being of students is a concern not only for people like me, faculty and staff, but for students themselves, right? That's why you hear me say quite often, hey, listen, if you're struggling with your mental health, we have a counseling service on campus. Please take advantage of that. I will be happy to give you the information because we know that this is a very difficult time for many people, right? You're exploring how to become an adult. Some of you are experiencing budgeting and different kinds of responsibilities for the first time. Um, you are meeting new people. You are challenging ideals that you've always had. So you often are going to class, you have homework, and you're working. So it can be a very challenging and very stressful time. Um, so it might be that students are exploring some of these anxieties through the ghost stories that they tell. So one of the other things Tucker does here that's really important is she describes the process of ostension. So ostension is a word that we use to talk about when people act out parts of legends with the intention of recreation in some way. So, in Tucker's example, there's a couple that goes into the basement to investigate a presence that appeared in the mirror. In the same way that the guy who is now the presence in the room once went to the basement to commit suicide. All right. It's acting out part of a legend. And we see this all the time in film, and generally it results in bad things happening. The virgin lights the black flame candle. The girl goes downstairs and accidentally cuts herself to bleed all over the summoning circle. So just remember the word ostension because it will come up again. Actually, it will come up quite a bit. Um, in closing, Tucker mostly asserts that while pre-adolescent girls seek mirror ghosts in order to, quote, see an aggressive mother figure who initiates them into the perils of female maturity, college students, quote, see aspects of their adult selves that are evolving, including gendered roles in society, sexual relationships, social roles. So, what do you think about this? I mean, you guys are college students. Does this seem to fit with your experience? Um, I think there are parts of this analysis that make sense, certainly, but how does this fit into your own experience of college life? And I think you guys certainly have memories to share. You shared some of those with me last week. Um, so I think that you can think about this in terms of the experience that you are having right now, and you can look at the way that she's analyzing these kinds of things, even if you haven't played mirror games. I think you can look at the analysis and still see whether or not you feel like it makes sense based on what you yourselves are experiencing right now. And the next article that I ask you to read for this week is from Grider, and it is about haunted houses. And I love this discussion of haunted houses. So we talked about ghosts last week, and some of you guys shared your stories with me, which is wonderful. I always enjoy reading those. Um, I will tell you so I have two stories that I usually tell when we talk about ghosts and haunted houses. So I'm going to tell you guys those stories. The first story is a personal story. Um, when I was younger, um, still an adult, but a younger adult, I lived in the house that had belonged to my grandparents, and my grandfather had passed away in the house. And he had died of cancer. And the house was new when my grandparents bought it. No one had lived in it, so they were the only people who had lived there. And my grandparents, every single morning of the world, had their coffee. And my grandmother had a percolator, which is a type of coffee maker that is rather old, and you guys may not be familiar with it, but it makes a very particular sound when it's brewing coffee. And so I can remember um, every weekend for a great many years, one of the first things I heard when I woke up was this percolator perking their coffee. Um, and my grandfather had a very particular way that he drank his coffee. He had his cup, which was white with blue stripes, and he had a saucer. And so he would put his coffee in the cup from the pot, and then he would pour the coffee into the saucer, and then he would slide the bottom of the cup across the saucer to keep the coffee from dripping off the bottom of it. Now, he wasn't successful in this. There were always coffee rings on the table where he would sit his cup down. But that is the way that he did it. Pour coffee into saucer, slide the cup across the side of the saucer, set it down, and then he would drink his coffee from the saucer. All right. Um, so after my grandfather died, my grandmother lived in the house for probably 10 years on her own. And then she really began to struggle with some issues around her memory and mobility and things like that. So she moved in with my parents, and I moved into her house. So I was alone in the house, and I woke up one morning and I smelled coffee. And while that may not be weird for some people, it was a little strange for me because I don't drink coffee. Um, I do have a coffee pot, and I do typically keep some coffee in my freezer so that if I have friends over who drink coffee, I can they can have a cup of coffee. And my best friend will tell you that I'm terrible at making coffee. I don't drink it, so I don't know how it's supposed to taste. And I have made coffee that she says is strong enough to stand up and walk to her. So I normally don't make coffee, and certainly not in the morning. But I woke up and I smelled coffee. And I very distinctly heard the sound of the percolator, and I heard the sound that my grandfather's cup made sliding across the saucer. And at that point, my grandfather had been dead for probably close to 15 years. But I smelled coffee and I heard those sounds, and I was just kind of laying there in bed. And people have asked me if I was dreaming. I'm sure that I was awake because I remember very particularly the way the room looked. Um, and I just kind of laid there for a few minutes, kind of trying to figure out if I was really smelling what I was smelling and hearing what I was hearing. Um, and so I got up to kind of go down the hall to the kitchen, and when I got there, I didn't hear it or smell it anymore. And so I, I thought it was odd, but I really didn't feel any need to explain it further than that. Um, and then about 6 months later, it happened again. And I woke up and I smelled coffee and I heard these noises that I was pretty familiar with. And I just remember thinking that my grandfather had come to visit again. And again, when I got up and I went down the hallway, there wasn't anyone in my kitchen, and I didn't hear the percolator anymore. So again, I don't think I've ever. I wasn't scared. I knew what it was. I knew who it was, and it just didn't. I wasn't bothered by it. I was actually a little bit comforted by it because I felt like my grandfather had come to visit me. So, I don't really feel the need to explain that beyond that, other than I think I know what happened. And I think that that is something that doesn't happen every day. Um, and I'm not sure that there is a rational explanation for it. Um, I can't seem to find one, and that's okay with me. Um, And so the other story, so I suppose I lived in a haunted house, although I will say that I didn't have any other experiences like that in the house other than those two times. Um, so the other experience that I'll tell you about, and some of you guys on the discussion board from last week talked about Waverly Hills and experiences at Waverly Hills. So I have not been to Waverly Hills, but I did go to a place called the Trans Allegheny Lunatic Asylum, which is in Weston, West Virginia. And it is very similar to Waverly Hills, except that it was an asylum and Waverly Hills was a TB hospital, fancy. It was a sanatorium, so fancy TB hospital. Um, and when we went to Tala, um, I was 3 months pregnant with my daughter. I was with my husband and my stepson. My stepson is he at the time was 8 years old. And so we did not want to take the ghost tour that they offer there. We wanted to take the historical tour because my husband and my stepson were both very interested in architecture. And Tala is the largest free cut stone building in the United States. So it has very interesting architecture, and so were interested in seeing that. So I particularly asked if the historical tour talked about ghosts at all because I did not want my stepson to be scared. And she told me that they did not. And so that was that. And so my husband and my stepson came in out of the car and we looked around a little bit before our tour started. And then our tour started and we were walking through and they were telling us about um, some different historical context for the hospital. And so we reached this room, which they said was a gymnasium. And the walls were painted yellow, and it was like a concrete floor. And the lady mentioned that many times when women were committed to the asylum, and it was largely women that were committed to the asylum, that their children were often committed with them because of the view that mothers were the best caretakers for their children, and so therefore children should remain with their mother even if they were committed and hospitalized. So oftentimes there were many children there. Um, and so we had walked around a corner and they had the gymnasium proper cordoned off. You couldn't go in there. They had ropes up. And my stepson looks at me and looks at his dad. And my stepson has an autism spectrum disorder. And so we were standing kind of back from the crowd so that he didn't feel kind of enclosed. And so we were standing kind of in the back. And so my stepson looks at me and he looks at his dad and he says, "That girl is not supposed to be over there." And I looked at him and I said, "What girl?" And he points to the gymnasium and he says, "That girl over there, she's not supposed to be there. That's off limits." And I said, "Is there a girl over there?" He said, "Yes, there's a girl right there and she has brown hair and she's wearing a yellow dress." And I said, "Okay." I said, "Well," I said, "let's not worry about what she's doing. Let's just focus on what we're supposed to be doing. And we're supposed to be walking through to the next room." And he says, "Well, somebody should get her because she's not supposed to be over there." And my husband and I looked at each other, and neither of us saw a girl standing over there. So we went through the next room, and then we went out into a courtyard. And so while we were in the courtyard, my stepson turns around and he looks at his dad and I, and he says, "You didn't see that girl in there, did you?" Um, and I said, "No, Garrett, I didn't see her, but that doesn't mean that you didn't see her." And he said, "Well, I saw her and she was standing next to the wall and she was not supposed to be there." And I said, "Okay, buddy, I understand." And so my husband and I again just kind of looked at each other. And then we went, our tour was over relatively quickly after that. And we went to the car. Um, So I don't know what he saw. Um, I believe that he believes he saw someone standing there. Um, I believe that his brain works in a little bit different way than a neurotypical brain does. And so I don't know what to make of that. Um, I don't really feel the need to explain it beyond that. I believe that he believes it. And so my husband and I both kind of leave it at that. So Grider here is talking about haunted houses, haunted places, but houses in particular here. Um, She makes some interesting points here in her discussion of the haunted house and how it kind of figures into our collective consciousness. One of the things that first kind of draws me into her analysis is that she points out the ways that children play with the limits of reality through what she calls meta houses. So these are like doll houses, or playing house in houses, or tree houses, or fun houses. And haunted houses, she says, are just one more of these kind of meta houses through which the limits of reality are explored. So if you think about that, when children play with doll houses, they're learning how kind of houses work, and families live in houses. When they play house, they are exploring relationships and how relationships are supposed to go. And often children are reenacting the relationships that they see at home when they play house. They build tree houses. If you look at fun houses, those are really designed to test our ability to determine reality versus illusion. So she says that haunted houses are just one more type of meta house through which we kind of explore the limits of reality. She also points out that people have a psychological attachment to their home, right? So the violation of this sanctuary seems incredibly personal and terrifying. And in a couple of the stories from last week, you guys talked about being in having a house that was haunted, where you heard things or saw things, and that it was very frightening. And I think that anytime you think about your home being violated in that way, you're supposed to be safe there, and of all of the places that you are during the day, your home should be one of the safest places. And so the idea of that being violated is really, really personal, and it's really, really scary. So she says that we, quote, inhabit them. So she's talking about houses here. We inhabit them with the anxieties that haunt our day-to-day lives. So if we look at that, she's saying that we can infer what people's day to day anxieties are when we look at the stories of haunted houses. This is functionalism. It's doing something. These stories are doing something. And here she says that they are revealing our day to day anxieties. Um, she also points out that in some stories, the house itself is a kind of character. Um, an excellent example of this is a novel called The Haunting of Hill House by Shirley Jackson. If you've ever read that, there have been a couple of movies based on that. There was the original one that was made back in the 1960s with Vincent Price, which is a very good film. There was a very bad film that was made in 1999 with like Liam Neeson and Catherine Zeta-Jones and uh, Owen Wilson, I think. Forgettable film. And then, of course, Netflix did a mini series, a television show based on Hill House. So the opening of Shirley Jackson's Hill House kind of sets the house up as the character. And that opening is Hill House, not sane, stood by itself against its hills, holding darkness within. It had stood so for 80 years and might stand for 80 more. Within, walls continued upright, bricks met neatly, floors were firm, and doors were sensibly shut. Silence lay steadily against the wood and stone of Hill House, and whatever walked there walked alone. Um, so the house is more than just the ghosts that inhabit it. It partners with the ghosts to assault the living. All right. So there are other examples of this. There is the Winchester Mansion. Um, we see this in Rose Red, if you've seen that miniseries. The Murder House season of American Horror Story, which was the first story. There are others, maybe Crimson Peak. I don't know if you've seen that. Um, um, very good gothic romance, but really this idea that the house is partnering with the inhabitants, right? With the ghosts that inhabit it to make this kind of assault on the living. Um, so one of the things Grider points out is that hauntings didn't become attached to places until the Romantic period. So that was around 1800 to 1850. So that's going to be prior to spiritualism, like almost immediately prior to spiritualism. So she points out that the literary tradition of haunted houses is somewhat different from the oral tradition of haunted houses. But the once fine homes that were boarded up and allowed to fall into disrepair express the financial and social anxieties of people. She says, quote, "The houses of popular fiction are a metaphor for the despairs and fault lines of contemporary society, moral, psychological, and economic." That's on 146. Um, so if you look at the media depictions of haunted houses, you see this, right? Typically, the purchaser of the home in these media depictions does so because of a purchases this particular home because of the desperation for home ownership, right? And owing to its dark past, nobody else wants the house, thus it's purchased at a rock bottom price. You see this in American Horror Story Murder House. You see this in the Amityville Horror, The Conjuring, at least the second, I think, part of the franchise. You see that. Um, there's a newer film out called The Witch in the Window. Um, Again, the house is purchased at a very, very, very cheap price, um, usually owing to its history, which the new owners may or may not know about. And thus they are sort of trapped there. So they can't leave. The desperation for the home leads the inhabitants to be trapped there financially and emotionally. So this can be seen as a comment on the social fabric of wealth versus poverty, right? Um, it is usually a really, like, the people in these homes in these depictions, they cannot leave them because they lose a significant financial investment. They won't have a place to live, they can't afford to move, those kinds of issues. Grider also discusses that oral stories of a haunted house are far less dramatic than those depicted in media or literature. Right. And if you watched the episode from Ghost Hunters last week, the guys commented on the story about the axe murder in Florence Schneider as being, quote, too fabulous when compared to the other less dramatic hauntings on the hill. So the axe murder was the story that seemed the easiest to debunk as being just a story rather than having some basis in fact. Now, Western is home to at least one really fabulous murder. And so I'm a little skeptical of dismissing any story out of hand as being too fabulous. But, you know, the depictions in media of haunted houses are often way more dramatic than, for example, any of the stories that anyone told last week about living in a haunted house. Um, Grider also points out that when one is asked to describe a haunted house, it invariably seems to resemble the opposite of the enchanted castle from folk tales or fairy tales, if you like. It's large but not welcoming. It's drafty, it's cold, it's smelly, and it's usually in disrepair. Enchanted castles are full of music and the bustle of life and laughter. Haunted houses have strange, discordant sounds. Um, there are moans, there are screams. Thus, a house on the actual landscape can become haunted in the popular imagination by being isolated, large, and in states of disrepair. Right? If the owner is elderly or reclusive, that's even better. So, as Grider points out, even though any house can have a ghost, our conception of haunted houses is fairly consistent from literature and media. Um, so, in my experience, and you may have different experience, but in my experience, I will say that this seems consistent. Um, so, I will tell you two more stories to kind of illustrate this. So my husband is very indulgent of my love of folklore, specifically supernatural folklore. And so he is willing to indulge many of my legend tripping tendencies. And thus, on our honeymoon, we went to Salem, Massachusetts. And um, we got married at the end of September. Our anniversary is this week. And so we were there for the first week in October, which is a lovely time to go to Salem. You can experience it in all of its witchy glory. It's very festive and it's wonderful. So the trip was a little bit last minute, and so I booked us into a bed and breakfast for the week after seeing a couple pictures online and just checking the availability. So when we got there, it was nighttime. It was a huge multi-storied Victorian house right on the canal. There were no other inhabited properties around it. It was completely dark. We had to call the owner to come and let us in and bring us keys. During the week that we stayed there, we were the only people in the house. And upon the owner showing us around and then promptly leaving at night, my husband immediately looked at me and he said, "We cannot stay here. This is prime haunting property. We will be slaughtered in our sleep by the resident axe murderer." And he was convinced that the house was haunted. So the house was old, and I would not say it was in disrepair, but the plumbing was a bit loud, and the radiators were hissy, and the floors were creaky. And the fact that we were isolated, and the house was really big and rambling, and old, right? Again, Victorian. Those were the primary motivations for my husband's reservations. Now, we were not axe murdered. I thought it was a lovely stay, but he was convinced that we were going to be staying at a haunted house. The other story that I will tell you is about a house that I drive by, or I used to drive by. I'm very sad. In the tornadoes last December, the house was damaged beyond repair and was torn down. But it was a lovely old house. I'll post a link to some pictures of it. It was called Broadway, and it was out on Louisville Road, 31W, on the way to Park City. And it was a house that dated back, I think, to the 1850s, I believe. So for as long as I can remember, Broadway changed owners pretty frequently. And the last time that it sold, it was actually sold at a master commissioner's sale. Um, so if you look at the house, it was big, it was brick, it had big, pretty columns on the front porch. It was really quite lovely, but you could tell that it was old and that there were repairs that needed to be made. And so every time I would drive past it, knowing that no one owned the house for a very long period of time, I would generally think it was haunted. It sat out in the middle of a field. There weren't any homes nearby. Um, I did know a family that moved in there for a time, and I actually asked them if it was haunted. They completely avoided the question, which to me was as good as saying yes at the time. I have not been inside the house and I never will be. I'm not the only person that has determined that it's haunted. It was widely uh, reputed to be haunted in the community. Um, so, what is it about Broadway that was so haunting? So if we look at Grider, we can get some insight here. It had the necessary prerequisites of being isolated from other buildings. It was an old historic home. The exterior was not completely nondescript, but it isn't more than mildly evocative either. There was a stairway for ghosts to travel up and down. Remember, we talked about liminal spaces, and stairways are spots ripe for supernatural activity. And there was a basement where Grider asserts would be similar to being buried alive if you were trapped in that basement. Also, so many of it, there are lots of anxieties about being buried alive. I think that many of those anxieties are similar to what people feel in caves, and a couple of you talked about Mammoth Cave in your discussions last week. I think that is applicable here as well. Um, so, Grider asserts that the haunted houses of popular media and literature have become a kind of cultural trope that we use. And she says that everyone knows what a haunted house looks like, and that idea is reinforced through all kinds of commercial marketing. So the pictures that I will post were of a virtual tour of Broadway when it was being sold. So it looked like a haunted house to me, and it fits the description that's been reinforced through our culture. As I said, when the tornado came through last year, Broadway was destroyed, and I've been really sad about that. But times change, and we have to change with it. So I'm interested to hear what you guys have to say about haunted houses this week and about media depictions of haunted houses, about ostension and mirror ghosts and things like that. So make sure you do your discussion board. We're getting to the point in the semester where I see some of you falling off on your participation. Um, Please don't. I don't want to lose you halfway through the semester. We're 6 weeks in. That means we have 2 weeks to be in halfway. Just hang with me for a little bit longer, guys. If you have any questions or you need anything, please feel free to email me. If it's an emergency, text me. I'm more than happy to talk to you guys when I need to. All right. Have a great week. I'll see you soon. Bye.